stunting of African population is jeopardizing the economic growth. I think we can discuss the premises of this stance of seeing African people as a means to achieve inclusive growth, and then you'll ask, well, for what? As opposed to just seeking to feed Africa and her people for the sake of feeding Africa and her people and guarantee a minimum level of dignity. But I think this is a story for another day. But this declaration also recommitted to ending hunger by 2025 and also committed to reduce stunting and underweight from respectively 10 and 5% by 2025, and focusing on the 1,000 days agenda. So I'm sure that you have heard from Africa Union and its institutions about the 1,000 days agenda. So it stands also for the other declaration that was adopted in Malabo in 2014. So the solutions are here, but where do we stand today? 20 years after CAADP was adopted and almost 10 years after the so-said Malabo Declaration. So what we see is a chronic underinvestment in agriculture, and this has contributed widely to hunger up until now. There's been stock taking about where we stand in terms of the Malabo Declaration. And we know that the vast majority of African governments, 48 of them, reportedly spent an average of 3.8% of their budget on agriculture, as opposed to the 10% that they committed to. Some countries even spent as little as 1% on agriculture. We also know that nearly 75% of these governments have reduced their agricultural spending following the COVID crisis. So this is very worrisome. We agree on the cause, we agree on the solution, what should they be, but they are not implemented. Why? Well, there's many reasons, I'm sure, but one of the reasons that I see is that the governments are not held accountable for their own commitments. So it's not about coming up with new solutions or coming up with new commitments, but it's really about how do we make these the power accountable. And from where I stand, I think that civil society should play a big role in holding power accountable. And from where I stand, our role as OXFAM should be to support civil society in holding power accountable with research, with the right tools, with the right connections, with the right resources, so that civil society can be strengthened and play its role of being the fifth power. Those are my preliminary thoughts about hunger being an issue of social justice and not charity. I will stop here so that we can have a little bit of time, hopefully, to share ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My mic has load shedding. Oh no. The power is back. Thank you very much, Fati. We've got representatives in the room from various partners, various organizations, and I'm just going to open it up to questions and comments, especially because the whole issue of government accountability or being held to account was raised by previous speakers, even before we had the session with you. So I'm going to just allow the conversation to flow and ask if anybody in the room has any comment, any input, any question to you. Yes, there's one. Please introduce yourself because Fati has not met you before.
Hi, I'm Diana from One Farm Share. So my question is, how do we get governments accountable? Because I think this is the biggest challenge that is there. I like what she said, that it's not that the solution is not there. The solution is there, but how do we get the governments accountable? Because if we can get past that hurdle, even if it's a little bit at a time, maybe we can get some ideas on how to go about that. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else before we go back to Fatih? Okay, while we wait, Fatih, maybe you can handle that question, and then there's another person here, but go ahead and answer the question of any ideas you may have about how do we hold governments to account.
Thank you very much. So I think that we should first think of governments as a whole. There's national governments, there's also local governments, and anything in between. So for me, it's really about how we allow them to have access, allow some individuals or some groups to have access to power. So it's really about democratic processes, where they work, where they exist. And fortunately, in South Africa and Southern Africa more generally, they tend to work pretty well. So it's really about voting, and it's also about voting with our feet and voting with our credit card, and making sure that when we purchase goods and when we purchase also services, we are aware of the power that we hold as consumers. But for this, we also need to make sure that there's a critical mass. If we are 20 people or 50 people voting a certain way, or engaging responsibly in our the way we consume, it's not going to make a difference. But what we can do as 20 or 50 people is to raise the issue for the general public to be aware of not only their rights, but also how they can leverage on their rights to hold power accountable. So for me, it's really about voting. It's about also consuming responsibly and using all these tactics to leverage or to put pressure on power. I can see something happening right now in Central Africa and in West Africa, where internet cost has risen dramatically because many reasons, but also the government's applying additional taxes to airtime and data. And citizens have organized themselves and went on strikes to put pressure on the governments. And because the governments are also affected by people not buying airtime and data because they're not collecting taxes, now they have to address the issue and make sure that the telecom companies are more reasonable in the prices that they are applying. And this is something in the span of a few days. You can see how a movement starting online is spreading very quickly through WhatsApp, through Facebook, a little bit through Twitter, and having immediate effects. So for me, this is just an example of how we can come together and work to defend our own interests. And I'm sure that this can be replicated in many, many aspects of how we engage with power.
Thanks a lot, Fatih. Over to you.
Good afternoon, Fatih. My name is Wendy Pakir. I'm a former farm worker and currently with a community-based organization. I think you started to touch on answering a part of my question when you spoke about the mass mobilization and people kind of organizing to address some of the issues. I was thinking, when I heard the statistics in terms of the numbers of people that are food insecure, people that are hungry, people, who can't feed themselves and their families, I'm thinking of the lot that I actually learned that we have enough food supply in the world. There's enough food to feed everybody, but there's a lot of waste of food as well to keep the prices up. Because capitalism is real, and those making profits, those owning the means of production, they want to keep the prices up and make maximum profits at the expense of the people that have the very least. And I was just thinking on the role of the African Union, because South Africa, like many other countries, they sign onto treaties, Millennium Development Goals. They say we're going to eradicate poverty, we're going to do this and that. And then coming 10 years down the line, and you see that very little has happened. So how do we hold, the African Union, they have an important role to play. They're bringing together countries and presidents and so forth. But I realize as you spoke that we can't rely on the government alone. It's something that we say for ourselves as well, but we haven't organized as much yet. We're not there yet. When COVID came, we said this was an opportunity to overthrow the systems of oppression. The perfect opportunity, because there was a problem and capitalism was in crisis. But we were not well organized as civil society, as the people on the ground. And I think much, much more needs to be done around it. And we speak about the weakening of social movements and organizations for many years now. And I think that we actually need to come to the point where we decide this is what we're going to do now. Because 10 years from now, the hunger statistics is going to be more. Poverty is going to look different as it's looking now. It's not going to look better because climate change is real. Our food security are threatened in so many ways, and it's actually scary. So to the point where I don't even know what to say further because, we think of the generations to come. Not only the quality of air they're going to breathe, but also the quality of food they're going to eat and what's going to be left behind for them. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Any thoughts on that? I think for me, the most important question was around how do we leverage the AU as an example, particularly because that's where leaders need to hold each other to account. Any thoughts on that, Fatih?
Thank you very much, Lebogang. And I do agree with everything Wendy has said. I think one point that is coming out is food wastes. And I'm sure you have discussed supply chain issues. And we've seen through COVID lockdown periods how we were dependent on food coming from outside the continent. I think that AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is an opportunity for Africa to rely more on herself to dissolve the barriers for intra-African trade and specifically food trade. I know that AFCFTA is trying to organize civil society so that they can have some kind of insights coming from people like you, Wendy. I know that civil society met on AFCFTA issues a couple of times and that they are trying to make this much more organized and streamlined. And Lebogang, as for my thoughts and what we can do as OXFAM in Africa, we do have an influencing office in Addis Ababa, working closely on one hand with African Union and her members, but on the other hand also making sure that anywhere we can, we are bringing in civil society. So I would urge you, Wendy, to make sure that you participate not only on discussions happening at African level, SADC level, but also if you're aware of anything in your area of expertise or area of work related to an Apex African organization. These are the organizations that we are going to work with and make sure that they have a platform in African Union and that their voices are heard at the African Union level.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, there's a question at the back. Go ahead.
It's a comment. Hi, my name is Bongile Cele. I'm a farmer in the inner city of Joburg, and I'm also a member of an NPO called African Women in Agriculture. So we have looked at situations that we're finding, and I'm happy that you've addressed the issue of saying let the fifth power arise so that we use civil societies to actually change the narrative concerning our communities. Because if we don't go back to grassroots, which is back to basics, where we say let's address issues in communities where we have homes where people go to bed hungry, what are we doing? So we embarked on a farm in a box where we partner with sponsors to say sponsor these boxes, we give it to kids at school, they take it home, then they start their food gardens. And then we've just partnered with churches now, because that's a bigger group where they have lots of land which they are not using. And we are saying, get your communities to actually use those lands. And then on the municipal side, we've approached municipalities to say, all these lands that are not mended, which have been turned into dumps, we go and clean them and we start food gardens. And we get communities to participate. So I think we should actually be looking at taking a stand to say the change will begin at grassroots level. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got another question here. Let's just take this question or comment before we go back to Fatih.
Good afternoon, Fatih. It's Ramon here from OXFAM. Just to hear a little bit of your thoughts around the issue of closing civic space. You have highlighted the role of OXFAM in supporting civil societies to address the issue of accountability. However, we know that globally, but more importantly in Africa, the space for civic action is being closed. And there's alarming tendency of countries enacting laws or otherwise that prevent citizens to exercise their democratic rights, like expression or association or whatever. So my question then is, how can we as Oxfam partner with local organizations in Africa to drive...
Can you take the microphone? I can't hear you very much. Yes.
Okay, sorry. To derive a specific and context-driven strategies so that we address these issues. Because in many of the countries where the space is closing, the discourse is that civil societies are not bringing interest of citizens, but they are bringing interest from the outside, from the global north, if I could put it that way. And how can we really have a strategy to contravene that? And what the role Oxfam can really play to support those issues? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, Fatih.
Thank you very much. I love these questions. First, from the lady from African Union, African Women in Agriculture. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but I really like your comments. I was reflecting on how colonization has actually harmed us a lot. It has separated us from our knowledge, which was what you can think of a very simple and basic rural knowledge that we don't have anymore. And then because we don't have this knowledge, then we depend on external stakeholders to cover our basic needs. So I'm very happy that you are implementing this project of teaching kids to farm in the cities and I guess also in other parts of countries. But I would urge you to even think of how can you also reconnect grown-ups with this ancestral knowledge of farming. Africa has the most land that we can use to grow our food, but still we're a net importer of food when it comes to our relationship with external stakeholders. So please connect us back to this ancestral knowledge of farming so that we can all be able to grow some of our food and be less dependent on corporations and on external stakeholders. Romao, you raised a question that can occupy us for a whole day on how can we prevent the closing of civic spaces and how we can work with civil society. Obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all. A solution that can make sense in Mozambique or in South Africa can throw you in jail in even Uganda or Senegal. So I think our role is really a facilitation role where we can gather some knowledge from the various experiences that we are encountering in Africa and beyond, and try and see how we can codify this and what lessons we can learn from this so that we can share with other civil society members in other contexts. When it comes to closing of civic space, yes, there's a role of the global north, or how I call them, minority world countries. Because when you say global north, you're also including Australia, which is not in the north for me, but well, also a story for another day. But we are influenced, yes, by interest from minority world countries. Because also we are not reaching in so many cases this critical mass we were talking about earlier of people saying, you know what, this is something that is happening today, but it can lead to worse. And when it comes to closing of civic space, it doesn't happen overnight. Something that we have seen, I don't want to preempt any research that has been done, but some things that we know is that it's not happening overnight. There's usually some weak signals that we don't take seriously. And then some laws are being passed that we can't really connect with shrinking of civic space. And then some specific groups of people, specifically vulnerable people, are targeted. And also majority of people don't see the connection with their own situation or the own space they have. And then it grows slowly and steadily until we realize that, well, there's no civic space, or the civic space has closed, and there's little possible to do in terms of expression. So I would urge you, Romao, to continue working with civil society. And really, we should all work together across Africa and beyond to make sure that we share lessons and that we provide civil society with the right tools for them to address these issues, and again, be the fifth power that can really weigh in a public discourse that is more protective of civic space.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Fatih. We've come to the end of the session, and I, on behalf of everybody who's in the room, really like to thank you very much for coming in and sharing your insights, sharing your knowledge. We do miss you in the room, but thank you very much for making time to address us. I think, as you can hear, you know, the way that I can summarize the session and the questions is the issues of solidarity, of working together, but also of understanding the intersectionality of the issues that you are speaking about. And maybe just a last point around the issue of shrinking civil spaces is that they are shrinking globally. And I think the issue of solidarity should be where there is an opportunity, whether there is a permissive or a much more open legislation in one country, we should play that solidarity role of supporting those whose own policies or climate may be less so. You know, the world, particularly with connection, you know, on internet, like we are able to connect right now, enables us to be a community beyond borders, a community that's not defined by geography. And I just hope that one takeaway that we have here is how do we build that solidarity? We share lessons from each other, even beyond the geographic borders that we have. Because one thing that may be a constraint in one country is probably something that is able, to happen in another country. And so how do we pledge solidarity with each other as we basically face what I would call, a pushback from all ends, whether it's from the north, the south, the west, or the east. On that note, colleagues, let's give Fatih another round of applause. And really, thank you, Fatih. I'm going to stand up to show the T-shirt that I'm wearing from a campaign run by one of our partners here from Women on Farms. It's called Feminist Reparations. I can't read my own T-shirt, but I hope you can read. This is what civil society is doing.
I want mine.
Yeah, you want one? We will send you one. We will send you one, yeah. And the earrings from one of our vendors here in, who are displaying the work. So yes, we are talking about problems, but we are also really, really blessed by a lot of the projects and the efforts by women, by farm workers, who are really working in solidarity with us. We will send you a pair of earrings, Fatih, and maybe a bottle of wine, because there's also wine that called Sesfigile, that is produced by a black woman, a winemaker. So while we reflect on the challenges, there is also a lot that is going on. And I hope our work in OXFAM, in partnership with you in OXFAM in Africa, because we are at the southern tip of the same continent, is that we collaborate together and amplify the voices of everybody that's in the room. On that note, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
On that note, take your mic.
Thank you so much for that, Lebo. Another round of applause to Lebo for also moderating that like that on her feet. Are you okay? Inside this pot? Okay. Yeah, well, while Lebo is looking for her things in the pot, can I also say I'm also happy to be wearing the Women in Farm T-shirt, as well as the jacket from one of the marketers over there. So it's like, we have to practice what we preach. We have to practice what we preach, and I think we're doing exactly that. The next speaker is also going to be coming through video. So please just be patient with the sound and the visual guys while they prepare that for us. And as soon as they succeed in doing that, I shall come and introduce Bernadette. You can play, are we? One thing I don't do is sing. Wait, the people who sing, please somebody song Nyana. That would be nice. Who sings? Wendy sings. Here, Wendy, the microphone is yours.
Igama lama kosi kasima libongwe igama lama kosi kasima libongwe ma libongwe ma libongwe ma libongwe Malibongwe igama lama kosi kasi Malibongwe igama lama kosi kasi Malibongwe 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 igama lama kosi kasima libongwe igama lama kosi kasima libongwe malibongwe 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 Libongwe, die naam van die vrouwenrechten moet geprys word. Die naam van die vrouwenrechten moet geprys word, moet geprys word. Moet geprys word. Moet geprys word. Moet geprys word. Umandla. Pambili women's rights. Pambili. Forward to food security for all. Forward.
Umandla. Awethu. Amen. Thank you so much for that. We are moving on with the program. The energy is picking up. That's amazing. So the next presenter is also going to be presenting via video, and they also have a presentation for us. The technical team is ready. Her name is Bernadette Gualandi from OXFAM South Africa. They are the program lead under Saving Lives and Building Resilience, as I said, for OXFAM South Africa. This particular topic that they will be speaking on is anticipatory action and food insecurity. Please put together a warm round of applause for Benedetta, and you can go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me nicely? Can you hear me? Okay. So, yes, because, yeah. Okay, so you can hear me, sorry. Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm sorry I'm not with you because for familiar problems, I couldn't come to Cape Town. I will not be long, but I will talk also about two things. One is the food crisis and the relationship with displacement and anticipatory action, as the speaker said, and the systemic crisis, how the food crisis in reality is a systemic crisis. So we talk in the previously about how climate change is amplifying the food crisis, and how the food crisis is not just a crisis of the food, but has an impact, a cascading effect on thousands of things, from health to education. So it's like a ripple effect of a food crisis. One of the consequences one of the consequences of the food crisis is displacement. And the two things, they go very, very close. They go one close to the other. And for me, it needs some of the reflection, because the food crisis is the crisis of people on the move. And why? Because when you don't have livelihood, when you don't understand, when you understand that you don't have a food on your table, you decide to leave. You go and leave. And all the crises in Africa and globally, if you can see, has a component of displacement. So the people, there is no food crisis globally that doesn't have a lot of displaced people. And displacement, so it's a consequences of food crisis, but also trigger other crises, like, for example, social conflict or other type of crisis. Next slide, please. So if it doesn't work, if you can move the slide. And also, yes, sorry, it doesn't. No, so, and then displaced people, why also, what is the point, what is the decision that push people to move? Because it's also very interesting to understand when a person that experience food insecurity decided to move, because not all of them decide, but what is the tipping point when a person decide to move? One of the things that we notice is, for example, the lack of ownership of the land. So like when you don't own the asset, when you don't own the land. That one is one of the things that together with the food insecurity push people to move. And then I want to reflect another aspect. People who are food insecure, they move, and usually they move in urban context. So usually a displaced person move internally from rural to urban, or they cross the borders, they go into another country. And for me, it becomes very interesting also to understand the food security in the urban context and the impact that food insecurity has on the context of an urban system. People usually, they move into very vulnerable areas in informal settlement where there is already a lot of pressure on food. And this one generates many additional crises. So that is why I said the food crisis is not just a crisis, a systemic issue. It's a really crisis that generate other crises. In the urban context, the problem is that people rely on the market. So the food insecurity in an urban context is very much more complicated than the rural one, because you need to buy the food, you need to, and the cost of the food compete with other costs, like the cost of the house, the cost of the school. So compete with many other costs, and people who are food insecure in the urban context, they continuously move from one side to another, checking to reduce the cost of living. So the food insecurity in urban context is also something that we really need to explore better. Then as I go back into the systemic issue. So yes, this one is the second slide. As you can see, what I was saying, the number of migrants and forced displaced community, you can imagine in 2020 was around 3 million in Southern Africa. So, and include internal displacement and cross-border displacement. The next one. Yes, also, yes, the climate food crisis, as I said, for displacement is linked to the capacity to cope. So I already talked about it, and the fact that people move because they don't have capacity to access food. But for me, as I said, the point here is, when do you take the decision to move? Because as I said, if you own the land, if you own the asset, you are less exposed to move, to change, to find a new solution. So even accessing the land, own the land, can be really a mitigation strategy for the people who are food insecure. Next one. Then, as I said, the urban food insecurity, so the income poverty. So the fact that the food insecurity in urban areas mainly rely on cash and on prices, and also people they struggle to access food in the urban context. But is also true that the urban context allow you is also very key for the food chain, for the food supply chain, because in the city is also the place where you have the storage facilities, where you have the transport, where you have the infrastructure. So investing and working in the urban context is also very key. Because if we need to intervene in the food system, the urban context becomes very, very key. Next one. And then the food insecurity and the displacement, the systemic risks. Before, yesterday, we talked about early warning systems, and someone talks about the early warning system and the importance of having this early warning. I would say, yes, they are important, but more importantly is the impact-based forecasting, something that also the government is not really, no government in Africa are really and seriously looking at it. What is the impact of a climate change on the food supply chain? Which kind of anticipatory action we can put in place that they are based on understanding the causes that a crisis, that a risk can put on the food system. And I'm saying this one because it's very much to the governance of risk, because actually any emergency response to food crisis happen when there is a declaration of disaster. So there is no any reallocation of funding from one department to another, or special measure happen only when there is a declaration. So when the crisis has happened. So we, as a Oxfam, we are also working a lot on changing that perspective and say, let's focus on the impact, let's understand, let's develop our anticipatory action based on the impact that a crisis has on the food and the consequences, the cascading effect on the health, on the social conflict, on displacement. The next one. Then, so what are we doing I will be very quick because I'm late and there are other speakers. So what we are doing in Oxfam is to include displacement and food security, to try to push the government to look at the two issues together and to link food security within the risk management policies. To really make sure that there is an integration between food insecurity and protection risks. And then we also we are adopting integrated approaches. So we are also building sustainable resilience. So we have different projects in Madagascar. And I will also allow a colleague from Madagascar, from the government of Madagascar, because we are working very closely with the government with an integrated approach where we are looking at the system itself and not just at the food supply chain, but also at the infrastructure that allow the food system to work. We are looking at early warning systems, so safe havens. Next slide. We are looking at, for example, enhancing the drainage capacity to avoid the flooding. So to avoid that farmers or urban or the market in urban areas is completely flooded. The reconstruction of 3 bridges, because they allow the people and also the food to be still delivered when there is a lot of crisis. And Madagascar is very prone climate risks. So you can see we are, as a Oxfam, taking a very integrated approach. We are working on the eco-based system, so we have rehabilitation of mangroves and different livelihood. We are looking at the urban greening, so how we can also establish home gardening in the urban context. So our approach is really integrated, looking at the system from infrastructure to ecosystem to early warning system, greening the economy. And then also we are working in Comoros. Comoros is also an island that is very exposed to climate risks. So we have a very big project on a rain harvesting system. So to allow the collection of the water, the rainwater, to allow the farmer to continue farming when there is lack of water, especially in areas where the water is a problem. Then we have also strengthening early warning, also in Comoros, community-based early warning, so that farmers or community are ready to respond, to anticipate the worst impact of the climate risks. So just to say, for me, concluding that the food insecurity is not just a problem of the food, it's really systemic risks that has a number of consequences, a cascading effect. I highlighted the first one that is also a very big one, that is displacement, but also the urban context, because people, food insecure, move to the cities. And the fact that we really need to adopt an integrated approach that looks at a different system, at a different sector within a system. So I know that my time is finished, so I will ask, if there is any question, or to the next speaker from the government of Madagascar, that is a partner of OXFAM in working in Madagascar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For this session, there won't be a question and answer session. We hope we can be understanding there. We are going to have Zicoline from Madagascar, who, please come onto the stage, who will also speak with a translator who I believe will be on the screen. And are you ready? Please give him a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zicolin. I come from Madagascar, and I work at the National Office for Risk and Disaster Management. Sorry, I will speak in French, but there is the translation. Je me tiens devant vous aujourd'hui pour
I stand in front of you today
pour partager le point de vue de Madagascar sur la question urgente de la sécurité alimentaire,
to share the point of view of Madagascar concerning food security,
notamment face aux défis posés par le changement climatique.
notably in front of facing the challenges that are imposed by climate change.
Comme nous le savons tous, le changement climatique est un phénomène mondial qui affecte tous les coins du monde.
As we all know it, the climate change is a global fact that are touching the entire world.
Mais ces impacts sont souvent ressentis avec plus d'acuité dans les pays en développement et particulièrement en Afrique.
And its impact are very felt in those countries or those developing countries, particularly in Africa.
Madagascar, en particulier, subit les effets néfastes du changement climatique,
Madagascar in particular also is facing the bad side of climate change,
entraînant une grave insécurité alimentaire et une perte de moyens de subsistance dans la partie sud du pays.
driving to a loss of food and then also creating a crisis in the south part of the country.
Tout le monde ici a attendu, je présume, le cri du programme alimentaire mondial selon lequel Madagascar est le premier pays à faire face à la détresse due au réchauffement climatique.
I believe everybody here will witness the cry or the shouting of the world crisis that Madagascar was the first also to shout when the National Organization of World Health called about.
Plus de 1,3 million de personnes, dont 30 000 personnes souffrant de la faim, avaient besoin d'une aide alimentaire et nutritionnelle d'urgence dans le sud du pays.
More than 1.3 million of people in the south part of the country were suffering for food crisis.
Le seul endroit au monde aujourd'hui où les conditions proches de la famine ont été causées par le climat et non par un conflit.
The only place in the world where the crisis of the food crisis have been mainly caused by climate and not by human crisis.
Environ un demi-million d'enfants de la région souffraient de malnutrition et 110 000 d'entre eux risquaient de perdre la vie s'ils ne recevaient pas des aides.
More than 500,000 of kids were suffering from malnutrition, and many more also would have died if they did not receive a support in terms of food or food support.
Tout cela s'était passé dans le contexte du Covid-19.
And all of this happened under the context of COVID-19.
Le gouvernement malagasy, avec le soutien de ses partenaires financiers, continue jusqu'à présent d'adopter son aide aux populations pour faciliter leur rétablissement.
Madagascar government, with its partners, are still helping those who are in need within the country.
De plus, le parti sud-est de Madagascar a été frappé par des cyclones dévastateurs l'année dernière et cette année aussi, aggravant encore la situation déjà désastreuse de notre pays.
Moreover, the southeast parts of the country have been also struck by cyclones that have devastated again the side of the country, and then also increased this food crisis problem.
Ces catastrophes naturelles ont détruit les cultures, le bétail et les infrastructures, laissant un grand nombre de nos citoyens sans accès aux nécessités de base comme la nourriture et l'eau.
These natural disasters have a result of destroying many culture, many flocks and sheep, and leaving the community without sustainable way of living.
Les habitants de cette région sont actuellement en situation de précarité aiguë.
People from this region are in a situation of a very high lack of situation.
Nous reconnaissons que l'insécurité alimentaire est un problème complexe qui nécessite une approche globale et intégrée.
We acknowledge that the crisis. We acknowledge that food crisis is a global problem.
Madagascar s'est engagé à résoudre ce problème et à travailler avec d'autres pays de la région et au-delà pour transformer les systèmes alimentaires africains afin d'améliorer la sécurité alimentaire et les moyens de subsistance.
So Madagascar also accept to work with the country in the regions and within the continent so that they can improve the food security within the continent and the system that exists.
Picture.
Okay, you have some pictures.
Les figures. The picture.
The first figure,
Yes.
the
First
global, the global context in Madagascar.
Next. Next.
Yes.
Cette figure nous montre les résultats d'analyse de tendances climatiques durant la période de 1901 à 2020.
This figure is showing us the trend, the climate trend of Madagascar since 1991 to 2020, sorry.
Nous voyons là-bas que les changements des précipitations annuelles, il y a les changements de température de terre et de la mer, les cyclones et le niveau de la mer.
Here we can clearly see the change of the rainfall, the temperature of the earth, the level of the sea, and as well as the cyclones and the level of the sea level.
Next picture. La figure suivante nous montre les résultats de sécheresse.
This following pictures is showing us the droughts.
Depuis 2016, les impacts du changement climatique se font de plus en plus sentir avec les sécheresses qui deviennent plus fréquentes, plus longues par rapport à sa durée et plus intenses par rapport aux impacts.
Since 2016, we can see that the impact of droughts have been becoming more and becoming more longer and lasting more longer and destroying and more and slowly but surely the grounds.
Thank you so much to both Benedetta and Zicoline from Madagascar. It's great to have representatives from all other areas, all different parts of the continent, all areas of OXFAM coming together in this way. And let's not forget, even as the program continues, that one of the things that has been coming up from the floor since yesterday is the need for this to not just end here, for there to be a pledge of sorts. So we are gonna, I know the program is a bit rushed now, but we're still gonna have to make time for that because I think it's critical as a way forward. So up next, we are going to have Teli Chauke, who is from Kuga Development Cooperation, speak to us. Terry has been kind enough to stay with us, even though they've had to leave for some time. They've got not too long with us, so they're going to speak for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we may take a question or two from the audience so that they're able to get to where they need to get on time as well. Please welcome Teli to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'd like to first, before I introduce myself, I'd like to first acknowledge the invitation and thank you very much. And I'm really excited because generally where I come from, at this hour, we're in the graveyard shift, right? And so the singing revived me, I must say, because I had quite a long night. The singing revived me and just the energy in the room is really amazing. So thank you for inviting me and thank you for making me remember what this work is about because this is where I started before I got to the industrial kind of space. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So my name is Teli Chauke. I'm from the Kuga Development Corporation. We adopt or we get a lot of names as we go through this life. Koega and Kuga, and sometimes I do feel like a Kuga, but that's a discussion for later in the evening, right? But besides that, thank you very much for allowing us this space. And Lebo, to you specifically, I've had two major inflection points. The first was as I was preparing to come to this event and I was considering and I was also motivating to my principals in terms of why we should accept this invitation. It was a major inflection point and I'll say why. And the next inflection point I had as I was sitting here worrying about my 4 o'clock meeting just now before you came up to talk to me to say it's my turn, I had a major inflection point. And that was, you know, around remembering what this work is about and why it's important. And firstly, the first inflection point was me as I was getting ready to come to this and motivating and writing my memorandum to say I'm coming to this event, I think it's important. I was reminded by what it's important to me personally and why it's important for this conversation to happen and to continue to happen. But more starkly, and sitting here over these last 2 days has reminded me of that, is how important it is to have varied voices participating in this conversation. So a lot of you, and certainly my principals, asked me, but why would you go to a food security symposium? We work with industrialization and investor attraction, automotive sector, and tire manufacturing and this and that. And for me, the connectivity became even more stark as I sat here in the last 2 days. So that was the first inflection point. And then the second inflection point, I started my career working for a small research-based NGO in the water sector. We were working on multiple use water systems and interacting with local communities, and in particular women, around how we preserve the natural environment. We work specifically around wetlands and how we can actually use the natural environment for intercropping and promoting our agricultural practices, not only for our subsistence uses, but also for commercializing and graduating towards the next level in terms of economic activity and so on. So for me, those two inflection points have really come together in this presentation, specifically because of the inputs that I've heard over the last 2 days, is that my history in the water sector, my history working with local governments, very difficult customers. I also worked for about 12 years with local governments around creating opportunities for not only small-scale farmers, not only small-scale industrialists, but also for the common man to be able to identify with what this development agenda is that we're trying to drive, not only as a country, but as a continent as well. And so enter my inflection point specifically around today is not only understanding that the varied voices are important for this conversation, but that this conversation is important to the development project as a whole. And that means that no voice And Lebo, you said this when you were closing the previous session that you moderated, was that communities shouldn't, or this community should not be defined by geography. And so I want to, as I go into my presentation, and I've already spent 5 minutes of my allotment, is that this community shouldn't be defined by sectors, not only just geographies. It shouldn't be defined by whether you're commercial or you're an industrial player and so on. We should be defined by the goal, which is sustainability and for our communities to thrive. So as I introduced the Gucha Development Corporation, I just wanted to emphasize those. And I said it's 2 inflection points, but as I carry on, I realize that they're myriad. There are many inflection points. Being here is an inflection point, and hopefully we can talk about that later on. So I'm going to introduce to you what the Gucha Development Corporation is. As I was being briefed, Lebo, to come and give my input, I was told not to advertise. So I'm not going to advertise what our corporation does, but I will advertise a little bit about special economic zones and the role they play in supporting this project that you're driving, this development project, this very important work for our society, and what role we play as we catalyze industrial development. I think it's an important and critical role, and it's part of those many varied voices that are important in this conversation. And that role is really structured around symbiosis. Different communities that interact and work together to achieve certain goals. And so we call it, where I work, we call it industrial symbiosis, because we try to marry environmental outputs, social impact outcomes, together with socioeconomic development. And of course, we'd like to attract investment and get those billions flowing into the country. So we call this symbiosis, or an industrial symbiosis. And that's the critical role that I feel that special economic zones play. So special economic zones are set up in terms of a legislative requirement around the SEZ's Act in South Africa, primarily to catalyze economic development and investment into the industrial economy of South Africa. But as we work in this space, we are evolving. We're evolving such that we're embracing ESG outcomes around your environmental impact, your social impact, and primarily, which is very important at this juncture in South Africa, good governance. So those issues are also quite relevant for this conversation. And then, of course, I'll talk to the partnerships, which I feel, when I look at my history, looking back at the different roles that I've played in my career, but also the conversations that I've had in this room or listened to, is how critical partnerships. And a couple of inputs, I remember an input that Grant made around financialization and commercialization, as well as the One Farm's presentation yesterday, for me, just emphasized the importance of partnerships. Okay, so 7 minutes down as I introduce the presentation, so I'm gonna really have to step on the gas a little bit. So the Gucha Special Economic Zone is operated by the Gucha Development Corporation. We are a Schedule 3D entity of the provincial government of the Eastern Cape, but we have a global footprint. We have a footprint in terms of project management in a couple of countries on the continent. We also have an implementing agent role that we play in South Africa, where we basically build major infrastructure projects, clinics, schools, and so on. We are known, though, our calling card is around operating the Nelson Mandela Bay Logistics Park, as well as the Gucha SEZ, the Special Economic Zone. So the Special Economic Zone is quite, in South Africa, and we're very proud of this, it's the largest one in South Africa. So I'm sure you've heard of Atlantis here in the Western Cape, you've heard of a number of Richards Bay, Dube Trade Port, those are industrial development zones. And they're operated by either public entities or private corporations. We are a public entity playing in the corporate world. And a lot of our partners and stakeholders sometimes think that we are play acting. We pretend to be in the corporate world. But once you get to know what our business is about and how we seek to partner with you, and then you'll realize that it's us melding, that symbiosis, melding the corporate world together with the developmental agenda. Thank you. No, I'm not done. I liked that reaction. I think it does signify that you're enjoying this. If you're disappointed that I'm done already. So on the Special Economic Zone, we're based, the Special Economic Zone is in Gqeberha, in Port Elizabeth. We have, it's about 9,003 hectares, and we're divided into 14 zones. So we house within the SEZ the port of Ngqura, which is slightly adjacent to the port of Port Elizabeth. We're separated by the N2 highway and a couple of suburbs, but we are close to the port of Port Elizabeth, and we play a complementary role. We then have 13 other zones. One is the logistics park, where we host VWSA and its value chain in terms of the automotive industry and composite parts that support that. But within the SEZ principle or proper, where our business center is located, we have an agro-processing, maritime, mariculture and aquaculture zone. We have a zone around your pharmaceuticals industry, logistics, automotive, a number of industries that are quite important downstream in terms of the agro-processing and agricultural sectors. And I'll draw those connections in a little bit. Thanks. So for me, why I consider these sectors related and important is that specifically if you go onto our website and you enjoy a tour through our corporate video, we walk you through each of the zones. But for me, there are about 4 or 5 that are quite critical. One is our logistics zone, which is in our Zone 1 South area of our map. And that speaks to, in terms of supporting the agro-processing industry, it speaks to your storage, cold storage, your transfer of food products, packaging industry, and so on. So that's where we provide, as an entity, we then provide top structures for investors, for them to then invest and grow their businesses and operate out of our SEZ. There's Zone 3, which is our general industries zone. We've got the port area, we've got the mariculture and aquaculture zone. And then, very exciting, we're also responsible for developing the Wild Coast SEZ. The Wild Coast SEZ, based in Mthatha, focuses predominantly on agro-processing, and specifically on the small scale operator, or the small scale industrialist or investor around agriculture and agro-processing. So there are myriad opportunities there for exploring partnerships, but also for starting to catalyze the growth and progression of small to medium enterprises, small investors, towards the formal participation in the agro-processing economy. Thank you. So this is where what I've said so far connects with why we're here these past couple of days. And I really want to speak about the role of SEZs. And I head the Sustainability Business Unit. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Kucha. And a lot of my comrades, a lot of my colleagues think that, these are soft, wafty issues, but the business has progressed so fundamentally to start thinking about responsible corporate citizenship. And not just from a CSI perspective, where you're investing in social development or you're investing in small projects, but from a partnerships perspective, with the end goal of supporting industrialization. And when I say this, it means whilst we have skills development programs, we have programs around trying to leverage and connect small to medium enterprises to funding opportunities, we also look about progressing them to be able to join or plug into the industrial revolution. And the fourth industrial revolution, so data issues are also quite important. And how we do this, firstly, is recognizing that food security and the resilience thereof, or the resilience of food ecosystems, is obviously founded on 4 principal issues: the accessibility of food, access to food, utilization of food, and then the supply of food. So traditionally, special economic zones or industrial development zones would be perceived to really be working around the supply of food, in terms of that logistics value chain, the cold storage, the fleet management, etc., around supplying of food to markets. Traditionally, the industrialization of food production systems is also viewed from that perspective of commercial corporate food systems. And this was mentioned in a presentation around the One Farm presentation that I enjoyed very much. And so traditionally, when we think about industrializing food production, we think of your mass production, we think of these big corporates that have the lion's share of the market, because they're well equipped from an infrastructure perspective. Policy favors them, the market shifts favor them because they're cushioned. They are able to absorb risk because of insurances, they're able to absorb risk because they themselves can provide for themselves alternatives in terms of utilities, your water, your energy, and so on. So in most cases, the small operator is dependent either on the state or on the grant framework in terms of donor funding and donor support and external support. So we find that the externalities of thriving in the food systems market is often a lot easier to bear for the commercial entities. And that's why it allows them the benefit or the luxury of focusing on supply side problems, the infrastructure, the market instruments, pricing, and so on. At a smaller scale level, small operators, manufacturers, producers often are not able to absorb these risks and market shocks themselves. They do need intervention. And in most cases, it should be provided, that intervention should be provided by the state as well as donor agencies. So the externalities are outside of the control of small producers and small to medium enterprises in terms of what happens to them sometimes is defined outside of their own span of control. So what this proposes is that your small-scale producers are then part of the missing middle. Policy doesn't quite cover you. Fiscal models don't quite cover you. Infrastructure development doesn't quite cover you because it's migrating to urban centers, as the previous presentation suggests. So it means that when you're in the rural hinterland, you are still striving to meet those basic needs in terms of access to water, access to grain, access to feed, access to seed, and so on and so forth. So the missing middle context remains quite relevant in the food production systems as we see it. And this is why we need to start thinking about the concept of sustainable food production systems, considering and catering for the entire value chain. And so we shouldn't be treating small-scale producers as the missing middle, but the missing start or the missing beginning. That needs to be catered for. So it's a conceptual ethos that we ourselves are starting to struggle to or grapple with in terms of how we absorb it into our own business model as an operator of a special economic zone. So then this allows us the platform to slide in to this gap that's presented by policy, funding instruments, and so on, by presenting, one, the physical space at competitive rates. That allows for collaboration between a number of producers to be able to access sites and facilities around agro-processing, to be able to leverage on economies of scale in terms of transport and logistics, storage, and so on. So whilst we do not present these as free solutions, but because we are supported by the state ourselves, we're able to start influencing the policy space as well as the fiscal space in terms of unlocking opportunities for all on the value chain, including the beginning, the middle, and the end, in terms of the consumer to be able to benefit. So our role effectively, and it's not a cast in stone role as yet, because we are also approaching sustainability in a very dynamic and evolutionary way that's constantly changing based on how we interact with stakeholders, is that we need to be able to de-risk small-scale production. So not only plug into that model that organizations like OXFAM have around skills development and knowledge sharing, but customize it to this industrialization concept. That's an important thing that we feel we need to do as an SEZ. We also need to look at how we then help small-scale producers realize economies of scale by helping them or supporting those institutions that help them organize, so that they are able to speak to the volumes that the big players are looking for, the volumes around the cost of byproducts and additives and packaging materials and so on, so that we are able to start helping them realize gains in that aspect. And of course, we would like to position ourselves as being able to absorb these externalities that I said are really around market shifts and very far out of our span of control as individual operators or producers and so on. So by being able to leverage off of the community of other SEZs to make sure that we are creating a pipeline, especially around logistics and storage and so on, we're able to then connect different markets to one another and help ease the market or the route to market of producers. So in our minds, as the Development Corporation, we see the role of SEZs in this sector emerging, catalyzing, and getting stronger, specifically around supporting or enabling small players to plug into or fit into the route towards becoming big players. We know that we can't provide outright funding. We know we can't provide free locations, but we certainly can start helping the process by influencing the policymaking platforms, influencing how fiscal mechanisms are designed and devolved, even up to local government level, but also influencing our own agenda as we operate these SEZs to make room for organized groupings of producers and helping them leverage on these economies of scales that I mentioned. And I'm about to close, and I think I'm probably on my last 14 minutes of my 15. So which means I still have 14, right? All right, so this leads me, I think, to my penultimate submission on this topic. And I hope that you're able to follow. There's a rationalization somewhere, and I'm going to get to it in this last slide. But for me, what's important, these messages that I'm going to keep on summarizing, is that one, the voices for this conversation that are necessary have to be varied. They have to represent a dynamic range of stakeholders, all with different capabilities and roles. That's one important thing. But those varied voices have to be acting in concert. They can't be speaking against one another. And so when a person from an organization like mine does show up at an event like this, it shouldn't be surprising or discomforting to other contributors in the session. It should be, in fact, there's a new angle we can look at this, but there are also new opportunities that we can leverage on us, so I think that's important. And of course, right now, the rallying call, we're feeling the heat under our collars in terms of the SDGs. We've got 7 years left until we've met 400 and however many targets associated with the SDGs. And certainly we feel them on the southern tip of the continent and in many places in the developing world because we are the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. We are in fact so vulnerable to things that have nothing to do with us, like the geopolitical instabilities. They have every impact on the price of and availability of gas. Incidentally, we have projects around gas to power and those kinds of things that sometimes make our partners also quite uncomfortable. But all of these externalities have to be absorbed somewhere. And we often expect that states must play that role. But governments can't do it by themselves. They certainly need these varied voices to be speaking in the same way. So for us to be able to implement this 7-year time crunch that we're under in terms of the SDGs, we do need partnerships, focusing on a range of things, but predominantly also on the sustainability of our food production systems and the way we use food, the way we access it, the way we transfer it, and the way we also use its waste and byproducts to incorporate into other aspects of the economic value chain and development. And so to do this, we need obviously to take advantage of the critical enablers at the macro scale, policy, et cetera, et cetera. We need to be those varied voices that are participating in the policy platforms, yes. And that is quite standard, everybody says that all the time. And I've seen how it sometimes works and how mostly it doesn't work. So sometimes, Sislebo, when you're participating in these IGR intergovernmental forums, it's just to, I was there. Yeah, and you might as well just take a selfie. What is important is having lasting contact with these forums, but being able to close the feedback loop. And I think these kinds of conversations and inviting your unnatural partners, because sometimes organizations like mine aren't really your natural partners. We kind of slide into your DMs, and sometimes we impose ourselves on you, but sometimes we also have happy accidents where we come across one another and we're able to support one another. And so in closing, I think 3 things: the critical enablers, your policy, your infrastructure. This last presentation, and I apologize, I've forgotten, I think it was Bernadette. In fact, it was Bernadette. She spoke about systemic crisis. And right now in South Africa, we're sitting on a rubric cube, that cube with many colors and if you don't have the cheat code, you'll never get it right? We're sitting in a rubric cube of systemic crisis. Infrastructure collapse, policy discord, political discord, energy crisis, water crisis. I come from the Bay, and a lot of my work has been around trying to find money for desalination, to cheat the system and deal with a climate problem that we're not the cause of, but has every impact on a variety of industries, including yours. So we want to center ourselves in solution making for that. But ultimately, we're in this Rubik cube that has many, many systemic failures and problems, including infrastructure, policy design, policy impact, etc. ad nauseum. What's important is how we then find out and deepen our knowledge about what is driving this crisis, what it's made up of, what parts are tolerable in this crisis, so that we're addressing or directing our attention to those intolerable aspects, like the food crisis, the water crisis, which translates to the food crisis, this water, food, energy nexus. There are a number of nexuses at play at any given point in time. It's not just food, water, energy. There's money, education, and so on nexus. There's the gender. There are many nexuses at interplay, and it's a huge matrix of complexity. But knowledge collaborations and partnerships will help us unravel those common threads and start following one line that would lead us to the same outcome. So our interventions have to be very intentional. They have to be intentioned. We can't just, fall into these rooms by accident and start partnerships. We have to have intentional partnerships. And I look forward to engaging with OXFAM further. I look forward to engaging with many of you here further around being intentional in the way we position SEZs to help and support this, this journey. And certainly, I think we've got a couple of things that we are able to do, especially around strengthening the knowledge economy. There's an interesting partnership we've developed with the CSIR around commercializing intellectual property. And someone was speaking about indigenous knowledge earlier on. So surely if we've developed a formula on how best to commercialize intellectual property, there is intellectual property around food production systems. How do we leverage that partnership as an SEZ that doesn't farm, but provides agro-processing facilities so that you can secure your intellectual property, commercialize it, turn it into rands and cents that you can invest in your production system that ends up with your products en masse in our agro-processing facilities and taking advantage of our logistics value chains to go to market. So I think those are important connections that we need to build. And I'll stop there. I don't know if you've been warned, I do talk a lot and very fast. I've got a lot more I want to say, but I'll save that for later on. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much for that very informative presentation. We are going to take a question or two or three very quickly from the audience. Does anybody have a question or comment to Telly? Anyone? There we go, over here. Thank you, with Simon.
Thanks. I would like to ask in terms of how can you help those farmers who are adding value to their products for export markets? Because you will find that they will have the products and they've added value to it. But when it comes to exporting, maybe to the European Union, like South Africa is part of the economic economic partnership agreements with the EU. So then that means that they would like to export their products to the EU. So how can you help in that aspect?
Thank you so much. I think that's the only question, and you can just unpack that. Or is there another one that we're missing?
I saw one at the back there.
Over there at the back. Is there a microphone? Awesome.
You should be careful, moderator. I might also just take over moderation. I'm enjoying this platform so much.
Yeah, we were watching your 4 p.m. time, but if that doesn't matter to you, it's okay.
It's 4, actually.
There we go.
Yeah.
I can assist. Thank you. Yinkom. So my question is on the special economic zones. Have you set aside space? Because I know we're moving into industrialization, because most of the food waste that we're looking at as farmers, we're saying let's rather do our own agro-processing locally and produce locally and keeping that content locally. So now with spaces that you have, because I've been to your place, it's massive. Do you have space for agro-processors And what is the cost for an agro-processor that needs space? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to please respond to those two questions?
Yeah.
And that's going to be it for the questions for this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll do this very fast because I do have a 4 o'clock commitment. I thought I'd respond to the easier one first, and there aren't any. So I'll just go with the first one. So what support might we have for connecting those products that have already got value added into them and they need to reach export markets? Okay, so we have a functionality or a unit that deals with trade facilitation. And our typical makeup for that work is facilitating the ability of an investor to land in the SEZ and be able to enjoy a number of benefits in terms of a easier process to deal with customs and so on and so forth and so forth. That trade facilitation role also looks inwards in terms of landing an investor, but also outwards in terms of those products that are produced by our 55 investors that are operational right now in the SEZ. How are they reaching their markets? We are called a transshipment hub. We've got, I think, on average, about 800 ships that pass us a month with containers of goods and so on and so forth. So our job is to facilitate that flow of goods. I have to be careful, though, in saying we do not manage the port. So that function is a function that's designated to the Port Authority, which is TNPA. However, we then provide the facilitation services in terms of the knowledge, the market information around pricing, but also things in terms of, what to expect from an excise duties and negotiating certain processes for an investor or a trader. And that's why we call it a trade facilitation role. And I'm oversimplifying. It's quite a complex role. It's meaningless to you because I'm speaking to investors that are already located in our site. What becomes important, I think, is how we then collaborate to tailor that package of services and offerings that we have to suit the emerging industrialists, to be able to fetch investors and say, partner with these guys. These are the volumes they can supply. You have to then meet your end of the bargain by connecting them to markets and fair prices. And then, of course, there's the Africa free trade issues and so on. So there are a number of packages that we have that just need to be landed in the right way for different investors. What we do have that's solidified is for current and future investors in terms of on the SEZ. What you're talking about is a long value chain that also occurs outside of the SEZ, of producers that are sitting in the hinterland or even in another province that want to use the port that sits in the SEZ to export. We have to be able to give them a fair service that allows them to be competitive. And that's certainly something that I think we need to have these conversations so we structure those service offerings more appropriately. Let me not talk too long because I might end up tying myself up in strings, and I'm very careful not to overcommit until we've identified partnerships and the needs that we want to service. But I really appreciate that question. I did take your contact details yesterday, and I'd love to have this conversation further unpacked, sir. On the last question around agro-processing, so Ceci, I mentioned that we've got 14 zones on the SEZ. So those that would fit the agricultural sector are myriad. So in the general services, I think it's zone 3, you would have your a number of your packaging companies, et cetera, et cetera. And then in another zone, I think zone 1, north and south, you would have your agro-processing, where, and there's an exciting project that I'd like to share with you. It's still in concept phase, so I can't share too much. But there where you would have, either your fruit pulp makers who would then connect to another investor on the site that turns that into either juice or ice cream or whatever. So we've got dairy, Kucha dairy located in the SEZ. So we have a number of investors that are located around specific zones. We also have a mariculture and aquaculture zone where we provide the bulk infrastructure. So I forgot to mention that we provide the bulk connectivity infrastructure. So your road infrastructure, your energy reticulation, your water reticulation, your return effluent in terms of your wastewater treatment, et cetera, et cetera. And then depending on the model which you take in terms of taking up tenancy, whether you're going to rent, so we build and pass on a facility to you that's built to spec, or whether you only want to lease land from us and you develop your own. But it has to be within the confines of our environmental authorizations, our licenses and permits, including land use management issues, environmental impact issues, and so on. So there are two models. I don't work in the commercial and leasing agreements sector, but I can connect you with colleagues who could tell you about rates. But what's important in that conversation is then speaking about at the different scales of maturity that enterprises are at. How are their rates, allowances, and so on and so forth, tax incentives, and those kinds of things. And there certainly are those instruments available. I just don't know too much about them. I'm an environmental, but thank you very much. And may I